Hi, I'm Noah, and today I'm going to be upgrading my 3D printer to make it quieter, faster, and just generally easier to use and better. So I've had my Ender 3 for almost 2 months now, and it's great. But being me, I just can't help but tinker with it to try and make it better. So today I'm going to be upgrading it with a bunch of different upgrades to hopefully help and improve it. So let's go through the upgrades. We have a Raspberry Pi, which will allow me to start, monitor, and stop prints via the internet, and it should let me make some pretty cool time lapses of my prints. A Raspberry Pi camera. This little webcam is attached to the Raspberry Pi, and it should allow me to monitor prints from anywhere, and it'll allow those time lapses I mentioned earlier to be possible. A BLtouch. A BLtouch is a bed leveling sensor that will determine the exact level of my print bed, and it'll make sure that the prints are always printed perfectly parallel with the bed. This should increase adhesion and reduces the chances of prints failing. Some stiffer springs will make sure that the bed stays level for longer and ensure consistent bed leveling across a print. Basically, they'll make everything less likely to change. A 32-bit board. Going from 8 to 32-bit basically means that the printer will be faster and be able to process more data at a time. This should allow me to print faster, and it should allow the stepper drivers to be quieter and lower temperature. Stepper motor drivers. These little guys will control the motors, and if all goes well, they should just plug directly into the new board and make those steppers run cooler, faster, and quieter. So that was all the electronic-y bits. I'll also be installing some 3D printed parts, such as a new cooling duct and fan cover, but we'll get into that later. Springs! So here's my Ender 3 at the moment. It's completely stock aside from those front drawers I downloaded from Thingiverse to hold all the tools and spare parts. Anyways, let's get these springs on. To install the new springs, I just have to unscrew it and remove the heated bed, and the old springs pop off right like so. Here are some new springs, much stiffer, and they go in just like that. Hotend. I downloaded and printed a Hero Me fan duct remixed for the Ender 3 from Thingiverse, and I'm going to be installing it to help with part cooling. It's a pretty simple installation, and this particular model reuses all the fans and screws from the original Hotend cover, meaning that I do not need to go to the store. The BLtouch mount did not quite align with the screw hole, so I just drilled it bigger, and it worked just fine. I screwed in the front fan and added the duct at the bottom, and all is going well so far. Now we come to the BLtouch. In the box there's a whole bunch of stuff, but all I really care about is the sensor itself. It requires threading a cable all the way up the Hotend cable sleeve, so I'm going to remove the old mainboard first, as I'll be removing it anyways. Now, I'd read that pulling this cable up was a pain, but oh my is it annoying. I figured out a method using a small Allen key, but even then it was slow. The mainboard, the heart of the printer. I got this big Tritech SKR version 1.3. It came with this whopping 256 megabyte micro SD card for the firmware. How generous of them! As it is bigger than the stock board, it's not going to fit in the enclosure, so I'm going to have to mount it behind the printer. I've already attached stepper motor drivers, and now all that needs doing is to plug in all the wires from the old board to the new one. So that just didn't work. I tried it off camera, and one of the stepper motor drivers started smoking immediately after turning it on. To add insult to injury, the board just didn't turn on without giving me a temperature warning no matter how much I tweaked the firmware. So I ordered a new board, this time the SKR Mini E3 version 2. This one uses soldered on stepper drivers, and it is exactly the same form factor as the original board, meaning that I can reinstall it in the same enclosure. It came with this rubber squeaky duct this time, so that's got to be a good sign. After screwing the board into the enclosure, I plugged all the wires in and it worked! I attached the BLtouch properly, as well as this mesh skull fan cover, and zip tied all the wires together, and we are good to go. OctoPi! So, I got a Raspberry Pi 4 for OctoPi, and this setup should... Shut up, Shut up. So I got a Raspberry Pi 4 for OctoPi, and this setup should allow me to monitor and control prints from anywhere without being right next to the printer, as well as make some really cool time lapses. I set up a 32GB microSD card with a version of OctoPi on it and inserted the Wi-Fi dongle. The 32GB might seem a little overkill, and it is, but it was the first microSD card I found when I opened my closet. The Raspberry Pi is then hooked up to the printer via a mini USB cable that will allow it to have complete control over the printer. I printed this camera mount from Thingiverse and bought a Raspberry Pi camera. A longer cable will be needed, as it will raise with the Z-axis to allow it to see the whole thing while time-lapsing. The Thingiverse case worked very well, and everything just snapped together without any problems. And there we are, ready to test. So here's an articulated shark model that I printed before the upgrades, and I'm going to reprint it now to compare. So the teeth in the original did not print very well, however the new one had many issues. Its layer lines were more visible, and it had some issues with adhesion, which you can see at the top of the shark here, when it actually came off the bed at the end of the print. So I adjusted my Z offset in the BLtouch settings, basically changing how close to the bed it prints, and I got this model. It's pretty similar to the first. I noticed slightly less layer line, but it is very similar. So are these upgrades useless then? No, absolutely not. For starters, this printer is now almost silent, whereas before it had this loud stepper motor whine whenever it was moving the motors. It should also now be able to print faster and more reliably, and I tested that and it works pretty well at much higher speeds. The octolapse functionality is great, and I really like the time lapses it creates. And the better cooling from the fan duct should help me to print overhangs when needed, not to mention that I never have to manually level the bed again. So with this aside, I used a newly set up printer to print out some parts for itself. First was a fan cover for the electronics. This one I modeled myself, and you'll be able to download below. I also printed a Raspberry Pi case for the back of the printer. This one I downloaded from Thingiverse, and I will link it below, hopefully. Installing it was pretty straightforward, and now everything is at the rear of the printer, nicely contained in a little box. And there you have it, my fully upgraded Ender 3, never to be upgraded again. Well, we'll see about that. For now though, if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. Otherwise, have a great day. Thanks so much for watching.